You are 7 years old. You are standing in a doorway in Antioch, and the room in front of you smells like incense and sweat and something underneath, both that you are too young to name. Your father is on a bed in the center of that room. Dark spots cover his skin. Froth has gathered at the corners of his mouth. He is speaking, but not to you. He is asking the men kneeling around him to swear an oath. Your mother grips a funeral urn that is not yet needed, but she already holds it like she knows. The men swear. Your father's hand drops. The room goes quiet in a way that is different from all the other silences you have known, and you understand, even at 7, that this particular silence is permanent. Nobody in that room looks at you. Not once. Weeks later, your mother will carry those ashes off a ship at Brundisium in the middle of winter, and the sound that rises from the crowd will be described by the only historian who witnessed it as one universal groan. Tribunes and centurions will carry the urn. The military standards will be stripped bare. The axes will be reversed. Temples across Rome will be stoned. Families will throw their household gods into the street. Newborn children will be abandoned by parents too grief-stricken to raise them. That is how much Rome loved your father. The boy is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. The father is Germanicus, the most beloved man in the Roman Empire. The mother is Agrippina, the elder, granddaughter of Augustus himself. And every history channel on this platform will tell you that boy grew up to become a monster. They are wrong. He was not born. He was built. Piece by piece, death by death. And when Rome finally finished constructing him, they handed him the keys to everything and then acted surprised when the building burned. His name was Caligula. And this is what actually happened. Now, before we go any further, if you are the kind of viewer who stays for the full story, who does not skip ahead, who actually wants to understand how history's most infamous emperor was manufactured by the empire that created him, then do me one thing. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear for the next hour is not the Wikipedia version. It is not the summary. It is the version built from the primary sources, and I promise you, it is worse than anything you have been told. Now, let us go back to the beginning. To understand what Caligula became, you need to understand what he was before Rome ruined him. And what he was, at the very beginning, was a mascot. His father Germanicus was the Golden Prince of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, nephew and adopted son of the Emperor Tiberius, grandson of Mark Antony on one side, grandson of the divine Augustus through his mother on the other. He was tall, brave, generous, and the Roman people loved him with the kind of devotion that made emperors nervous. He married Agrippina the Elder, a woman with more Augustus in her bloodline than Tiberius himself had, and together they produced 6 surviving children. They took those children everywhere, including to the Rhine frontier, where Roman legions held the line against Germanic tribes in forests, so dense the sunlight never reached the ground. It was there, on that frontier, that the soldiers saw something that delighted them. Germanicus's youngest son, barely old enough to walk, dressed by his mother in a miniature legionary uniform, complete with tiny military boots, Caligula. The soldiers who wore those boots on 1,000-mile marches looked at this toddler stomping around their camp and gave him a nickname, Caligula, Little Boot. It was a joke, a term of affection from 20,000 killers who thought a child in armor was the funniest thing they had ever seen. They adored him. They put him on their shoulders. They chanted his name. And that was the most dangerous thing that could happen to any child in the Roman Empire, because it meant the legions loved the boy more than they loved the emperor. Tiberius noticed. Tiberius always noticed. But before any of that mattered, there was the murder. In the year 19, Germanicus was stationed in Antioch, governing Rome's eastern provinces, when he fell ill. Not the ordinary kind of ill. The kind where the walls of your house are torn open afterward, and they find human remains buried beneath the floor. The kind where lead tablets inscribed with your name and smeared with blood are pulled from the foundations. The kind where a woman named Martina, known throughout Syria as a professional poisoner, is later found dead at Brundisium with a knot of poison concealed in her hair. Germanicus knew exactly who was responsible. On his deathbed, with his wife and children and officers around him, he said the names out loud. Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria. Piso's wife Plancina. He did not whisper it. He spoke it clearly and asked every man in that room to carry the accusation back to Rome and lay it before the Senate. Then he died. His body showed the marks, dark discoloration across the skin, froth pooled at the mouth, and when they burned him on the pyre, as Roman custom demanded, one organ would not catch fire. The heart. It sat in the flames, intact, refusing to burn. To every Roman who heard this detail, and every Roman did hear it, there was only one explanation. A heart saturated with poison cannot be consumed by fire. That was what they believed. That was enough. Agrippina took the ashes and sailed home, in winter, across open sea, because she was not the kind of woman who waited for safe weather when she had a point to make. She landed at Brundisium and walked off that ship holding the urn against her chest, and the entire population of southern Italy, or what felt like it, had come to meet her. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later with access to eyewitness accounts, described what happened next. Two cohorts of the Praetorian Guard met the procession in full mourning order. The magistrates of Calabria, Apulia, and Campania lined the roads. The urn was carried by military tribunes and centurions. The standards were unadorned. The axes were reversed. And as the procession moved north toward Rome, the crowds did not cheer or shout or sing. They groaned. One universal groan, Tacitus wrote. That was the sound. Somewhere in that procession, walking behind his mother, was a 7-year-old boy in miniature boots who had just learned the first and most important lesson of his life. That the people you love can be taken from you by men who will never be punished for it. Because Piso, the man Germanicus named with his dying breath, was later found dead in his own bedroom with his throat cut. The Senate called it suicide. The knife was on the wrong side of the body. Nobody investigated further. The empire mourned a prince. A 7-year-old mourned a father, and nobody asked which grief was heavier. Now, what followed was not sudden. It was systematic. And that made it worse. After Germanicus died, 3 things stood between Tiberius and unchallenged control of the succession: Agrippina and her 2 eldest sons. Tiberius did not eliminate them immediately. He waited 10 years. He let his prefect Sejanus build the cases, manufacture the accusations, turn informers into weapons. And then, in the year 29, the year the Empress Dowager Livia finally died, and the last restraining hand was removed from Tiberius's arm, he struck. Agrippina the Elder was arrested and exiled to the island of Pandateria, the same island where Augustus had once exiled his own daughter for adultery. Agrippina did not go quietly. During the arrest, or possibly during an interrogation, a centurion beat her so badly that she lost an eye. On the island, she tried to starve herself to death. They force-fed her. She tried again. They force-fed her again. The third time, they let her succeed. She died on the 18th of October in the year 33. Tiberius announced her death to the Senate and congratulated himself on not having her strangled with a bowstring. He expected gratitude for his restraint. Her eldest son, Nero Caesar, was exiled to the island of Pontia, where he died in 31. The sources do not agree on whether he was starved, driven to suicide, or simply killed. It does not matter. He was 24. Her second son, Drusus Caesar, received something worse than exile. He was imprisoned in the dungeons, beneath the Palatine Palace itself, in the beating heart of Rome, where Tiberius could monitor his destruction personally. The Senate was given transcripts of Drusus's final days. Tiberius read portions of them aloud. They recorded every meal denied, every cry for help through the door. Every curse Drusus screamed at the emperor as the days without food accumulated. And here is the detail that matters. When they finally opened the cell, Drusus was dead. He had survived for 8 days after his last meal was withheld. They knew it was 8 days because they had counted, and they knew what he had done in those 8 days because they found the evidence. The stuffing of his mattress. He had torn it open and chewed the filling. For 8 days, a prince of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, great-grandson of the divine Augustus, had survived by eating his own bedding. Suetonius records the Latin, mandendo e cubili tomento, by chewing the stuffing from his bed. Where was Gaius during all of this? He was being passed from household to household like a piece of luggage that nobody wanted to be caught holding. After his father's death, he lived with his mother. After his mother's arrest, he was transferred to his great-grandmother Livia. After Livia died, he went to his grandmother, Antonia. At 17, he delivered the eulogy at Livia's funeral, a public speech for a woman who had shielded him, given by a teenager who was not technically old enough to speak before the Roman people. He knew everything. He had watched his mother beaten and exiled, his brothers arrested and killed, his family's name dragged through the Senate as evidence of treason. He knew who was responsible. He knew the names. He knew the methods. And he said nothing. Not one word, not one expression, not one flicker of anything on his face that anyone could report back to Tiberius. He did not grow up with bedtime stories. He grew up with disappearances. In the year 31, when Gaius was 19, the summons came. Tiberius wanted him on Capri, the island where the emperor had retreated from Rome 6 years earlier and never returned. Villa Jovis, the main imperial residence, sat 354 meters above the sea on the island's eastern cliff. Below the villa, there was a specific outcropping that the locals had already given a name: Tiberius's Leap. It was where condemned prisoners were thrown from. Sailors waited at the base with boat hooks and oars to beat to death anyone who survived the fall. This was the house Gaius moved into. This was the man he was expected to live with, dine with, entertain, and never once displease. The man who had murdered his mother and brothers. And Gaius did it perfectly. A Roman wit named Passienus Crispus, who knew him during this period, said something about Gaius that captures those 5 years on Capri better than any historian ever managed. He said there had never been a better slave or a worse master. Gaius gave Tiberius nothing: no anger, no grief, no accusation, no flinch when his family was mentioned, no reaction when their fates were discussed at dinner. Suetonius says he ignored the ruin of his kindred as if nothing at all had happened. 5 years of flawless performance. 5 years of sitting across the table from the man who starved his brother to death and never letting his hand shake when he raised his cup. But at night, when the performance ended, something else emerged. He put on wigs. He dressed in long robes. He left his quarters and wandered the villa in disguise, watching the executions and the depravities that Tiberius staged for his own entertainment. And he sat in front of a mirror and practiced. Suetonius describes it precisely. While his face was naturally forbidding and ugly, Gaius purposely made it even more savage, practicing all kinds of terrible and fearsome expressions before a mirror. Alone, in the dark. A young man in his early 20s, rehearsing monstrousness like an actor, preparing for a role he knew he would eventually play. Tiberius saw it, or sensed it, or simply understood it the way one predator recognizes another. He said it plainly to those around him: "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people and a Phaethon for the world." Phaethon. The boy from Greek myth who demanded to drive his father's sun chariot across the sky, lost control, and burned the earth. Tiberius looked at Gaius and saw a boy who would set the world on fire, and he did nothing to stop it. Perhaps because he enjoyed watching other predators grow. Perhaps because he believed the Roman people deserved what was coming. Perhaps because by that point, Tiberius simply did not care. During those years on Capri, Gaius also learned something practical about power that would define his reign. He learned it from Naevius Sutorius Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had replaced Sejanus. Macro saw in Gaius a future emperor who could be controlled, so he offered his own wife, Ennia Thrasilla. He pushed her toward Gaius, encouraged the affair, and Gaius accepted it with a written contract. A promise of marriage, once he held power. Think about what that taught a young man who was already watching people through a mask. That the man who commands the Praetorian Guard, the most powerful military officer in the empire, will sell his own wife's body for a chance at influence. That loyalty is a commodity. That sex is a transaction. That every person who offers you something wants something larger in return. The boy who once wore miniature soldiers' boots on the Rhine frontier now walked barefoot through a predator's palace, making no sound. Capri did not corrupt him. Capri completed him. On the 16th of March, in the year 37, Tiberius died at his villa in Misenum. Or rather, Tiberius appeared to die. The doctor, a Greek named Caligula, had felt the emperor's pulse during a casual handshake at dinner 2 days earlier and privately told the household that Tiberius had less than 48 hours. When the old man stopped breathing, Gaius left the bedroom and stepped into the adjoining hall, where the household staff and courtiers had assembled. Congratulations began. The ring of imperial authority was removed from Tiberius's finger and placed on Gaius's hand. And then, someone came running from the bedroom. Tiberius had opened his eyes. He was sitting up. He was calling for food. The room froze. Gaius froze. The ring was already on his finger, and every person in that house had already declared their allegiance to the new emperor. If Tiberius recovered, every one of them was dead. Macro did not freeze. Macro walked into the bedroom and ordered the bedclothes piled onto the old man's face. Some sources say Macro smothered him. Others say Gaius himself went in and pressed the pillow down. Others say Gaius later boasted that he had once carried a dagger into Tiberius's bedroom, intending to avenge his mother and brothers, but had found the old man asleep and felt pity. Pity. That was the word he used. Whether it was true or a performance, it did exactly what it was designed to do. It told Rome that even toward the man who destroyed his family, Gaius Caesar had shown mercy. The man who had murdered his family died under a pile of blankets. There was no dignity in it. Gaius would have noted that. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary reversals of public emotion in Roman history. Gaius entered Rome on the 28th of March, and the city lost its mind. Not with relief, not with cautious optimism, with ecstasy. The Roman people looked at this 24-year-old and saw Germanicus resurrected, the Golden Prince, returned. The son of their murdered hero, come home at last. They called him Star. They called him Chick. They called him Baby, Nursling, Pet, Alumnus. These were the actual words the sources record. He was their child, their darling, and they screamed his name from the rooftops and the temple steps and the bridges over the Tiber. In the first 3 months of his reign, 160,000 animals were sacrificed across the empire in Thanksgiving. That is roughly 1,800 animals per day, every day, for 90 days. The blood ran in channels down the temple steps. The smoke from the altars was visible for miles. And Gaius gave them every reason to celebrate. He paid every bequest that Tiberius had left in his will and that Tiberius's household had tried to suppress. He gave every Praetorian guardsman 2,000 sesterces out of his own treasury. He gave every citizen of Rome 240 sesterces, plus 45 million sesterces in taxes that had been illegally collected and never returned. He freed political prisoners. He recalled exiles. He restored the power of the popular assemblies that Tiberius had stripped away. He published the imperial budget, something no emperor had done in years. He burned the documents. This is the detail everyone remembers. The new emperor, standing in the forum, publicly setting fire to the files of Tiberius's informers. The names, the accusations, the testimony that had been used to destroy families for 2 decades. Gaius burned them all, while the crowd roared its approval. Except he did not burn them all. The historian Dio, writing with the benefit of later evidence, records that Gaius kept the originals. What he burned in the forum were copies. He stood in front of the Roman people and performed a bonfire of mercy, while the real files sat in a cabinet in the Palatine Palace, waiting to be useful. Then he did something that the sources describe as though it were a piece of theater, because it was. But it was also real. Both things can be true. He sailed personally to the islands where his mother and brother had been imprisoned and died. He collected their ashes himself. He did not send a servant, or a freedman, or a military detachment. He went. He placed the urns in 2 biers on the deck of a birema and carried them across the water to Rome. And when he arrived, he timed the procession for noon, when the streets would be at their most crowded. The people wept. The new emperor who burned the informers' files was now carrying home the ashes of the mother and brother that Tiberius had murdered. Every gesture was calculated. Every gesture was also genuine. That was what made Gaius so dangerous, even in his golden months. He could feel 2 things at once. He could grieve for his mother, and also know that grieving for her publicly, at noon, on the busiest street in Rome, was the most effective political act available to him. He honored his 3 sisters on the coinage, depicting them as the goddesses Securitas, Concordia, and Fortuna. Security, harmony, and fortune. He included them in the annual oaths of loyalty that magistrates swore to the emperor, which had never been done for imperial women before. He made them visible. He made them sacred. He would later destroy them too, but not yet. There was one death during the golden months that the sources mention almost in passing, but that deserves more weight. Antonia, his grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his mother's arrest. She died on the 1st of May, in the year 37, just 6 weeks after Gaius took power. Suetonia says he may have poisoned her. Dio says he drove her to suicide by treating her with contempt. What is certain is the detail that came after. Gaius watched her funeral pyre. From his dining room window, he did not attend the ceremony. He watched from a distance, while eating, as the woman who had protected him burned. And at some point, during those first golden weeks, he said something to someone that the sources preserved. Bear in mind that I have the right to do anything to anybody. Memento omnia mihi, et in omnes licere. Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody. He said it the way someone reminds you of a fact they consider obvious. Not a threat, an observation. In October of that year, the 8th month of his reign, Gaius collapsed. The sources do not agree on what the illness was. They agree that it was severe, that it lasted weeks, and that at multiple points the household believed he would die. The city responded with a display of devotion that tells you exactly how completely the performance of the golden months had worked. Roman citizens kept all-night vigils outside the palace. Men posted notices offering their own lives to the gods in exchange for his recovery. A plebeian named Afranius Potitus publicly swore that he would fight as a gladiator if the emperor survived. A knight named Publius Atanius Secundus swore he would give his own life. Gaius recovered. And here is where every telling of this story goes wrong. Every documentary you have seen about Caligula uses the illness as a dividing line. Before the illness, he was good. After the illness, he was mad. Brain damage. personality change. The fever burned away the good emperor and left the monster. That is not what happened. And we know it is not what happened because of a man named Philo. Philo of Alexandria was a Jewish philosopher who actually met Caligula. He was part of a delegation sent from Alexandria to petition the emperor, and he wrote about the encounter in detail. He did not write as a historian compiling rumors decades later. He wrote as a man who had been in the room, and Philo's assessment of the illness was precise. He said the sickness did not create the savageness, it merely removed the pretense. Gaius had been displaying savageness his entire life, Philo wrote. He had simply overshadowed it with hypocrisy. The illness did not break the mask. It convinced Gaius that the mask was no longer necessary. He had watched Rome weep at the thought of losing him. He had watched citizens offer their lives for his. He had seen the full depth of their need, and he understood, with the clarity that near death sometimes provides, that they would endure anything. Rome had been applauding a performance. The illness ended the show. What stood up from that bed was not a different man. It was the same man. Finally honest. The first to die was a boy. Tiberius Gemellus was the grandson of the Emperor Tiberius by blood. He was young, possibly in his middle or late teens, and Tiberius had named him as co-heir alongside Gaius in his will. One of Gaius's first acts as emperor had been to adopt Gemellus as his son, making him the junior heir rather than an equal. That had seemed merciful at the time. It was the last mercy Gemellus received. Within weeks of recovering from the illness, Gaius ordered Gemellus to kill himself. The pretext was a cough. Gemellus had been taking medicine for a persistent cough, and when Gaius smelled it on his breath, he announced that it smelled like an antidote. An antidote against poison, an antidote against the emperor. Gaius said it plainly. Can there really be an antidote against Caesar? A tribune and a centurion were sent to Gemellus with a sword. What happened next is the moment I need you to hold in your mind for the rest of this story, because it is the moment that tells you what kind of reign this was about to become. Gemellus took the sword. He had never held one before. He had never been taught to fight. He had never been trained in the Roman aristocratic tradition of martial exercise because he had been kept isolated and sheltered his entire life. He stood there with this weapon in his hands, and he did not know what to do with it. He asked the centurions to show him where to put it. Where on his own body should he push the blade so that it would kill him? He was asking his executioners for instructions on how to execute himself. They did not help him. Suetonius does not say whether they refused out of protocol or cruelty, or simply because they did not know how to respond to a boy asking them that question. The sources say only that Gemellus died. That he managed it, eventually, alone, with no guidance and no comfort and no one willing to look away. He was perhaps 16 years old. He had never harmed anyone. His crime was having a cough during a season when the emperor had decided that coughs were suspicious. Gaius's father-in-law was next. Marcus Junius Silanus had given his daughter Junia Claudia to Gaius in marriage on Capri. The girl had died in childbirth, along with the baby. Silanus had expected, reasonably, that the bond of family would protect him. He had supported Gaius's accession. He had publicly advocated for the new emperor in the Senate. Gaius called him a golden sheep. Silanus was ordered to cut his own throat with a razor, not a sword, a razor. He did it. Then, Macro. Naevius Sutorius Macro, the Praetorian prefect, who had smothered Tiberius with bedclothes so that Gaius could become emperor. Macro, who had orchestrated the fall of Sejanus. Macro, who had offered his own wife, Ennia, to a young prince on Capri as a sexual instrument of political alliance. Gaius accused Macro of being a pander, a pimp. The man who had made him emperor was told that his greatest crime was the very act that had secured the alliance. Macro and Ennia were both ordered to kill themselves. They did. And then there was the matter of the gladiator vows. Afranius Potitus, the plebeian who had publicly sworn to fight as a gladiator if the emperor recovered. Atenius Secundus, the knight who had sworn to give his own life. Gaius had recovered. He sent soldiers to collect on the debts. Potitus was fitted with gladiatorial armor and put into the arena. He was driven through the streets with weights attached to his legs and then executed. Secundus was given the opportunity to fulfill his vow by his own hand. When he hesitated, Gaius had him killed anyway. 3 people close to him dead in less than a month. All 3 had helped him survive. That was the pattern. That was always going to be the pattern. Suetonius, who structured his biography of Caligula with unusual care, places a dividing line at exactly this point in the narrative. He writes, "So much for Caligula as emperor. We must now tell of his career as a monster." That sentence was written nearly 80 years after the events it describes, and it remains the most accurate summary of what follows. If you have made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are exactly who this channel was built for. We do not rush through history. We do not simplify it. We do not soften it. If you want to make sure you never miss what we put out, subscribe right now. And if you want to support the work directly, so we can keep producing documentaries at this level, check the membership options below this video. Now, back to Rome. There is a temptation, when describing what Caligula did during the final 2.5 years of his reign, to simply list the atrocities. Every documentary does this. They stack the horrors one after another, like items on a shopping list, and by the 3rd or 4th entry, the audience has gone numb. That is not what we are going to do. Each of these happened to a specific person. Each of them had a context. Each of them tells you something about the kind of mind that was now directing the most powerful state on earth. The executions began with what Suetonius calls a cost-cutting measure. When the price of cattle used to feed wild beasts in the arena became too expensive, Gaius reviewed the line of condemned prisoners waiting for execution. He did not check their charges. He did not ask their names. He walked along the row, stopped at a man with a bald head, walked to the other end, and stopped at another man with a bald head, and ordered everyone between the 2 of them thrown to the beasts. From bald head to bald head. That was the boundary. That was the system of justice. A man's place in a queue and the amount of hair on the heads of the people standing near him. He developed a method of execution that he used often enough for it to acquire a reputation. He ordered executioners to kill by striking repeatedly with light blows rather than a single fatal stroke. The instruction he gave became famous. It survived in Latin because people could not forget it. Ita ferut, se mori, sentiat. Strike him so that he feels himself dying. That was not rage. Rage is fast. That was craftsmanship. He wanted the dying to be an experience the victim was present for. He wanted them conscious for the duration. He wanted death to be a process, not an event. There was a father. Suetonius does not record his name, only what happened to him. His son had been condemned to death, and Gaius invited the father to attend the execution. Not invited, summoned. Attendance was not optional. The father watched his son die. Immediately afterward, Gaius invited the father to dinner. The same day, the same evening. The father came because refusing an imperial dinner invitation was itself a death sentence, and Gaius spent the meal being jovial. He cracked jokes. He proposed toasts. He encouraged the father to laugh and drink and participate in the evening's entertainment as though nothing unusual had happened that afternoon. Suetonius records that the father did laugh. He drank. He participated. because the father had another son who was still alive. There was a gladiatorial manager. The sources do not agree on his specific offense, only that it was minor enough that no one expected what came next. Gaius ordered him beaten with chains, not for an afternoon, for days. The beating continued over the course of multiple days, and Gaius did not order it stopped until, as Suetonius writes, the stench of his suppurating brains became intolerable. The man was beaten until the rot of his exposed skull reached the emperor's nose. That was the threshold, not death, not unconsciousness. Smell. There was a playwright named Attilan whose work displeased the emperor. He was dragged into the center of the arena and burned alive. A Roman knight who was being thrown to the wild beasts shouted his innocence from the arena floor, and Gaius had him pulled back, his tongue cut out, and then thrown to the beasts again. Because the protest, not the execution, was the offense. When the supply of condemned criminals ran short for the games, Gaius solved the problem by seizing spectators from the audience. He ordered their tongues cut out first so they could not call out to the crowd for help or protest their innocence, and then he sent them onto the sand. A slave who had committed a theft was punished by having both hands chopped off. The severed hands were tied together on a cord, hung around his neck like a placard, and he was paraded through the banquet that was in progress at the time, with a sign explaining his crime. The dinner guests continued eating. And then there was the matter of becoming a god. Gaius did not ease into divinity. He seized it. He took the temple of Castor and Pollux, one of the most sacred buildings in the Roman Forum, and converted it into a vestibule of his palace. He literally extended the Palatine Palace through the temple so that the divine twins became, in his words, his doorkeepers. He would stand between their statues and receive worshippers. He established a separate shrine to himself as a living god, with a full-sized golden statue dressed in identical clothes to whatever he was wearing each day. The statue's wardrobe was changed to match his, daily, by a staff of priests. The sacrifices offered at this shrine were not ordinary cattle or sheep. They were flamingos, peacocks, guinea hens, pheasants, and black grouse, exotic birds, beautiful creatures killed in beautiful ways to honor a beautiful god. He appeared in public dressed as Jupiter, complete with a golden beard and a thunderbolt. He dressed as Neptune with a trident. He dressed as Mercury with a caduceus. He dressed as Hercules, as Bacchus, as Apollo, as Diana, as Juno. He dressed as Venus. He held conversations with the statue of Jupiter on the Capitoline, which he claimed to hear speaking back to him. He told courtiers that Jupiter had invited him to share his dwelling. He built a bridge connecting the Palatine Palace directly to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, so he could visit his fellow god whenever he wished. And when a thunderstorm struck Rome, he did not cower like a mortal. He stood on the palace roof and screamed his own thunder back at the sky. He challenged Jupiter. He threatened him. "If you do not raise me up to heaven," he said, "I will cast you down to hell." Whether he believed any of this, or whether the entire spectacle was a calculated humiliation of the senatorial class that was required to prostrate itself before a man in a golden beard and women's clothing, no source from antiquity could decide. Possibly both. Both would be very Caligula. But there was something else happening underneath all of it, and the sources record it almost reluctantly, as though it embarrassed them to admit that a monster could also suffer. Gaius could not sleep. Suetonius says he never slept more than 3 hours in a night. He was tormented by what the sources call apparitions, visions that came when he closed his eyes. He told people that the spirit of the ocean had spoken to him. He dreamed conversations with things that were not there. And in the watches of the night, between the hours when the city slept and the hours when it woke, he did something that Suetonius describes with a precision that suggests he was drawing from eyewitness testimony. He wandered the long colonnades of the palace, crying out for daylight. Wandering and crying out for daylight. Alone, in the dark, the Emperor of Rome, walking back and forth through empty hallways, calling for the sun to come up, not commanding it, begging for it. Sometimes he summoned the 3 sitting consuls to the palace at midnight. They came, because refusing was death. He seated them on a stage. They waited. Then Gaius burst out in a tunic that fell to his heels and a short cloak, and he danced. He danced to flutes and clogs, while the 3 most powerful magistrates in Rome sat and watched in silence, and then he left. No explanation, no context. The consuls went home. And then Drusilla died. Julia Drusilla was his sister. She was the one he had lived with in what the sources describe as habitual incest since they were both adolescents, caught by their grandmother Antonia in the act, and never successfully separated. He took her from her husband Lucius Cassius Longinus and treated her, Suetonius writes, as his lawful wife. She was the one person in the imperial household, possibly the one person alive, who had known him before the mask, before Capri, before the golden months, before the illness made the mask unnecessary. She died on the 10th of June, in the year 38. And what followed was not grief. It was the end of the world. Gaius declared a period of public mourning during which it became a capital offense to laugh, to bathe, or to dine with family members. Think about the scale of that. Every citizen of Rome, every person in every province that received the decree, was forbidden from experiencing joy in any form on pain of death because one man's sister had died. He fled Rome. He ran from the city in the middle of the night, drove in a fury to Syracuse, and then turned around and came back without having done anything when he got there. He returned without shaving or cutting his hair. He did not shave or cut his hair for an indeterminate period after her death. He declared Drusilla a goddess, not a deified ancestor, not an honored spirit, a goddess. Panthea, he called her, the all-goddess. He appointed 20 priests to her cult. He placed a golden effigy in the Senate chamber. And he offered an extraordinary reward to anyone who would swear, under oath, that they had witnessed her ascending to heaven. A senator named Livius Geminius stepped forward. He swore, publicly and formally, that he had seen Drusilla rising up to heaven with his own eyes. Gaius paid him 1,000,000 sesterces. The trap was perfect. If you mourned too much, you implied she was really dead, which meant she was not divine, which meant you denied the emperor's authority to create gods. If you mourned too little, you showed insufficient respect for the imperial family. If you were happy during a period when happiness was a capital offense. There was no correct response. That was the point. He made a goddess of the one person who had seen him as human, and then he punished the entire city for her mortality. There were other spectacles. The bridge at Baiae. An astrologer named Thrasyllus, who had served Tiberius, had once said that Gaius had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding dryshod across the Gulf of Baiae. The Gulf was 3 miles wide. Gaius commandeered every merchant vessel he could find, lashed them together gunwale to gunwale across the entire Gulf, covered them with earth, and rowed across. On the first day, he crossed wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate, which he had taken from the conqueror's tomb in Alexandria, over a tunic of purple silk. He wore an oak leaf crown, carried a buckler and a sword. On the second day, he crossed again in a chariot, with a Parthian hostage prince named Darius riding beside him. That night, he threw a banquet on the bridge for his companions, and then, in the middle of the celebration, he threw them off the bridge into the water. When they surfaced, he attacked them with boats. The bridge had been built from merchant ships that were supposed to be carrying grain. The requisition caused a famine in Rome. People starved because the emperor wanted to prove an astrologer wrong. And then there were the seashells. Gaius marched an army to the coast of the English Channel near Bononia, supposedly to invade Britain. He drew up his troops in battle formation on the beach. He positioned his artillery. He sailed out into the channel on his personal warship. And then he sailed back, disembarked, and gave his army their orders. gather seashells. He called them plunder from the ocean, ode to the capital and the palace. His soldiers filled their helmets and their tunics with seashells. He erected a lighthouse on the spot to commemorate the victory. The Latin word Suetonius uses is concas. It means shells. There is no ambiguity, no alternative translation. He marched an army to the sea and ordered them to pick up shells. We are releasing documentaries like this regularly, and if you are enjoying this level of depth and detail, there is a simple way to make sure the algorithm keeps showing our work to you. Hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second. It changes what this channel can do. Now, let me tell you how it ended. To understand how Caligula died, you need to understand a man named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea was a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a career officer in his late 40s or early 50s. He had served under Germanicus, under Caligula's own father. During the Rhine Mutiny of the year 14, when Germanicus was nearly killed by his own rioting legions, it was Chaerea who cut his way through the armed crowd with his sword to get the general to safety. Tacitus records it. Chaerea opened a way with his sword through the armed multitude. He was a soldier's soldier. He had earned every scar on his body. And every morning of his life under Caligula, he walked into the palace to receive the daily watchword from the emperor. And every morning, the emperor humiliated him. The watchword is the daily password given to the guards. It changes every day. The emperor speaks it. The tribune carries it to the ranks. It is one of the most routine interactions in the imperial household. Gaius turned it into a daily degradation. He gave Chaerea watchwords like Priapus and Venus. Priapus, the god with the enormous phallus. Venus, the goddess of love. Both names, in Roman military slang, meant a castrated man, a woman playing at being a soldier. Gaius called Chaerea a wench to his face. When Chaerea approached to kiss the imperial ring, which was standard protocol, Gaius extended his hand, formed, and moved in an obscene fashion. He forced one of the most decorated soldiers in the empire to simulate fellatio on his fingers in front of the entire Praetorian officer corps. Every day. The other tribunes began to mock Chaerea too. That is how it works. When the most powerful man in the world degrades someone daily and nothing happens, everyone else takes it as permission. Chaerea became a joke. The hero of the Rhine Mutiny, the man who had saved Germanicus's life, reduced to a punchline. And when Gaius needed someone to torture an actress named Quintilia, who was suspected of involvement in a conspiracy, he assigned Chaerea specifically. To prove that the man he called a wench was capable of violence. To make the humiliation complete by forcing him to demonstrate his masculinity through cruelty. This went on for months. By January of the year 41, 3 separate conspiracies had formed against the emperor, and they merged into one. Chaerea was at the center. Cornelius Sabinus, another tribune, joined him. The freedman Callistus, who controlled access to the emperor's private quarters, provided intelligence. Aemilius Regulus and Annius Vinicianus provided senatorial support. The date was set for the last day of the Palatine Games, a festival of theatrical performances held in a temporary theater near the palace. The 24th of January. The omens on that morning were extraordinary, even by Roman standards. During the morning sacrifice, the knife slipped, and Gaius was sprinkled with the blood of a flamingo. He went to the theater in a toga, spotted with flamingo blood. The first performance of the day was a pantomime called Signoras, which featured a character who is murdered on stage. The same play had been performed at the theater in Macedon on the day that Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, was assassinated in his own theater by one of his own guards. The second performance was a farce called Laureolus, about a bandit chief who dies at the end. The actor playing the bandit had to vomit blood on stage, and the understudies began competing with each other to die the most convincingly. flooding the stage with so much fake blood that it ran off the edges and pooled in the orchestra seats. Gaius watched all of this with pleasure. He did not see the pattern, or perhaps he did and assumed it applied to someone else. At the 7th hour, around 1 in the afternoon, Gaius rose to leave the theater. He had eaten heavily the night before. His stomach was disordered. His companions urged him to stay, but he decided to leave, and the route from the theater to the palace led through a covered gallery. The Cryptoporticus. A tunnel of stone, roughly 130 meters long, roofed, with light entering from narrow openings along one wall. It connected the imperial complex to the public buildings on the Palatine Hill. On that particular day, a group of noble boys from Asia Minor who had been brought to Rome to perform in the games were rehearsing in the Cryptoporticus, practicing the hymn they were to sing at that evening's ceremony. Gaius stopped to watch them. The accounts diverge on what happened next, and I will tell you both versions because both are recorded and both matter. In the first version, Gaius stopped to speak with the boys, and Chaerea came up behind him and struck the first blow. Chaerea cried out as he swung, "Hawkage, do this." It was the ritual formula spoken by a priest at the moment of sacrifice, the word said, as the knife comes down on the throat of the animal at the altar. Chaerea buried his sword in the junction of Gaius's neck and shoulder. In the second version, Sabinus asked the emperor for the daily watchword before Chaerea struck. Gaius gave the watchword Jupiter, and Chaerea cried Acape Radum, which means, "So be it," or "Receive your due," and brought the sword down across the emperor's face. 2. The blow split his jawbone. What is certain is what happened after the first blow. Gaius fell. The other conspirators closed in. Not 2 or 3. A crowd, Sabinus, Chaerea, guards and officers who had been waiting in the galleries. The historian Josephus, writing from sources close to the event, records that the attackers struck one another in their frenzy to reach the emperor. And Gaius, lying on the stone floor of the Cryptoporticus with blades falling on him from every direction, did something that the sources record with a kind of horrified fascination. He called out that he was still alive. Aduc se viver. I am still alive. He said it as they stabbed him. He said it as the blows continued to fall. He said it with the peculiar insistence of a man who seemed to believe that informing his murderers of his survival would matter to them, as though the fact of his continued consciousness was itself an argument against what they were doing. The signal word came from the crowd of attackers. Repet. Strike again. They struck 30 times in total. Some of the blows went through his groin. Dio Cassius, and only Dio, records that some of the attackers tasted his flesh. His last words were, "I am still alive," and no one who heard them cared. The German bodyguards arrived too late. They killed several of the conspirators and, in their confusion, killed at least one innocent senator who happened to be in the wrong corridor. But the emperor was already dead. A tribune named Julius Lupus was sent to the palace to deal with what remained. He found Caesonia, Melonia Caesonia, the fourth wife. The woman Suetonius described as neither young nor beautiful. The mother of 3 daughters from a previous marriage, recklessly extravagant and utterly promiscuous, and the only woman Gaius had ever loved, with what the sources call passionate faithfulness. The woman whose neck he used to kiss and say, "Off comes this beautiful head whenever I give the word." Lupus found her beside the body. She was cursing her dead husband. Whether she was cursing him for getting killed, or cursing him for the life he had given her, or cursing him out of some emotion the sources could not identify, no one recorded. She saw the tribune. She understood immediately what was happening. She offered her neck. Lupus ran her through with his sword. Then there was the baby. Julia Drusilla, Gaius's daughter, 18 months old. The child he had carried to every temple in Rome, and placed in the laps of the gods. The child whose proof of paternity, he liked to say, was her violent temper, because she scratched the faces of the children she played with. A soldier picked her up and killed her by smashing her head against a wall. Suetonius records it in 3 words of Latin: "Parieti in lisa," dashed against a wall. He was 28 years old. He had ruled for 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. He died in a tunnel, still insisting he was alive. Nobody believed him. While the blood was still pooling on the floor of the cryptoporticus, a soldier named Gratus was searching the palace. He found a pair of feet protruding beneath a curtain. He pulled the curtain aside. Claudius, Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus, Gaius's uncle, 50 years old, stammering, limping, dismissed by every member of the Julio-Claudian family for his entire life as an embarrassment. He was so frightened that his legs would not work. The soldiers carried him in a litter to the Praetorian camp, where the guards, who had failed to protect one emperor, promptly declared him the next. The Senate met that afternoon and debated, for one brief and extraordinary session, the restoration of the Roman Republic. The debate lasted less than a day. The Praetorians had already made the decision for them. The Republic had been dead for 80 years, and it stayed dead. Chaerea was executed by Claudius's order, using his own sword. Sabinus was permitted to kill himself. The other conspirators were dealt with quietly. And Gaius's body was carried to the gardens of Lamia, the imperial gardens on the Esquiline Hill, where it was placed on a hastily built pyre and only partly consumed by the flames. They buried what remained under a thin layer of soil. Suetonius records what happened next with the tone of a man who finds the details significant but does not know why. Before Gaius's sisters returned from exile to recover the body and cremate it properly, the caretakers of the gardens reported disturbances. They were not specific about what kind of disturbances. They said only that not a night passed without some fearsome apparition in the gardens, and that the trouble did not end until the house itself was destroyed by fire. Here is what I want to leave you with. The Roman Empire watched a child lose his father to poison at the age of 7. It watched his mother beaten, exiled, starved. It watched his brothers disappear into dungeons and island prisons. It trapped him on a cliff with the man responsible for all of it and called it guardianship. It watched him perform flawlessly for 5 years under the eye of a man who openly compared him to a creature that sets the world on fire, and it celebrated when he emerged whole. Nobody asked what whole meant for a boy raised on silence and death. They gave him everything, every power, every resource, every life in the empire, placed under his authority. And when he used that authority, exactly the way his education had prepared him to use it, when he treated every person around him as disposable, because every person he had ever loved had been disposed of, when he made the entire Roman world feel the terror and helplessness that he had felt since the age of 7, they called him a monster. They called him mad. That was easier. Madness is an explanation that asks nothing of the people who created the conditions. Caligula did not go mad. He went honest. And honesty, in a system built on obedience and pretense, looked exactly like madness. The boots. The tiny boots on the Rhine. They dressed a toddler for war as a joke. Nobody was laughing by the end. But the story does not end in that tunnel. What Rome did to Caligula's body, to his memory, to his name after death, what the Senate voted to erase and what they could not erase, no matter how hard they tried, that is a different kind of horror, and we will tell it. Part 2 is coming. If this story changed how you see the Roman Empire, if it made you look at the word monster and wonder who built the thing we gave that name to, then share this video with one person. Just one. Send it to someone who still thinks monsters are born, not built. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on the notification bell, because part 2 of this story is something the algorithm will not show you unless you have told it you want it. You have just watched a premium documentary by Remnant, your ultimate history destination on YouTube. On your screen right now, you should see another documentary from this channel. Click it and keep going. Do not stop here.